So this is the risk management webinar that I put together just to add a bit more detail to everything you've got already in the workbook. But it is an area that might be quite new to some people, although more and more people are getting familiar with this, but hopefully it'll be helpful. So I'm just going to move on to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to just quickly run through a little bit about introduction to risk management, and then we'll look at some risk mapping, look at the 4 T's of risk management, look at the process a little bit, we'll look at a bow tie diagram to sort of work through an example, and then we'll look at what the ICH has just recently put in to the updated GCP guideline with respect to risk management. Okay, so risk management has been applied for many years to lots of different projects, so probably starting with the big engineering projects in the early 1960s, thinking particularly about the Apollo mission. They used very innovative in terms of their use of project management skills, but also within that a lot of progress was made with risk management methodology. So that's perhaps where it started, although obviously clearly the sort of idea of risk management has been around since early times. But anyway, it hasn't been a big factor in clinical research until reasonably recently, but has worked its way into our sort of clinical research and drug development projects. The first appearance from a regulatory point of view of the implementation of risk management practices was with the ICH Q9 Quality Risk Management Guideline in November 2005, and then a little bit later the ICH Q10 Pharmaceutical Quality System Guideline in June 2008. Now they were obviously both working around pharmaceutical quality, so the quality of the products, and that's where risk management first came in to clinical trials, but but it has made its way more deeply. So back in 2009 there was, I'm sure you've probably heard of these, the ISO organisation, so International Standardization Organisation. It's a bit of a funny term in English anyway, and they put together a standardized guideline on risk management outlining the principles and guidelines, and it's really top line, but it does set a framework for all sort of all risk management approaches in all organisations, and that's actually sits behind what has recently come in, as I just mentioned, with the ICH GCP guideline, and it also underpins what's in the forthcoming European regulation, clinical trials regulation, as and when we get to it. But anyway, we'll look a little bit later, as I said, about what it says in ICH GCP. So risk management, it's quite the idea of risk you can look at it from a number of different perspectives. Clearly we're very used to thinking about risk in terms of hazard, in terms of injury to patients or staff, and obviously that's a very important part of the risk management activities that we undertake all the time. You can also think of it as well as at an individual level. You can think of risk and hazard risk being at an organisational level as well. So an organisation obviously is exposed to hazard in terms of the impact on its financial security and its reputation. So there are things that could happen that could damage companies' reputation or organisations' reputation. So those you can think of as sort of hazard risks. There's also the idea of uncertainty or sort of control risk, which very much underpins pretty well every project you run. There's always uncertainty. You don't know for sure what is going to happen on your project. The uncertainty is obviously greatest at the beginning and hopefully gets less. But uncertainty can be good or bad. I mean, obviously not everything that you're uncertain about leads to a bad outcome. It could lead to a good outcome, but certainly certainly uncertainty is something in clinical trials we have to manage all the time. And the first thing that obviously in my mind comes to mind is the uncertainty around recruitment, so recruitment of patients, because you can obviously have an idea about how recruitment will go at the beginning, but it's something you have to keep an eye on, because obviously your understandings or the information you have at the beginning may tell you that you'll achieve a certain recruitment rate, but as the trial goes on, things can be very different. So that's sort of that's something to sort of illustrate the idea of uncertainty. There's also the idea of a risk being an opportunity. So this is obviously, a more positive slant on risk. So, and risk isn't always a bad thing, because sometimes, like I say, it opens doors, and you might want to take a risk in order to sort of gain a benefit. And just thinking about it, I had an idea about one risk that a company might take, for instance, in pharmaceuticals. You may have a very long-term clinical trial, and as you will all know, it's not a good idea to look in the data at an interim stage, because it has statistical ramifications, and in fact looking at the data too early can mean that your trial has to be, you've interfered with the statistics, and you actually have to allow for that in your final analysis. But sometimes a company may feel they want to, and they'll take that risk and the possible impact on the final statistics, and they will have an early look at the data, and it's a risk. But if the risk is positive, and say for instance even at that early stage it's clear that this drug is working, and it achieves the higher levels of statistical significance that might be needed, then the company could say, right, okay, well, we're going to make some decisions on the basis of this, or we will yes, and we'll move the program on. We won't wait until the results of this study are known before we do the next raft of studies, because if we do think it's working and we want to get on with things, then obviously the whole program can be completed more quickly, and the drug can get onto market more quickly, or you could lead to it could be leading to publication, but that could happen earlier as well. Information about the drug may be able to go out there earlier. So the benefit may be that the whole program is shortened, and there would obviously be benefits to that. There are also the idea of a compliance risk, which we're always working with all the time, of course. So there's always a risk that you will deviate from the regulations. So you are working with the compliance risk all the time, and obviously the idea is to make sure that you keep that well under control. So there are all these different types of risk, just to sort of, so when we say risk, it could mean many different things. So I'm going to move on now, and I'm thinking particularly about, in this instance, the event is a hazard, but it could be another sort of risk. But basically you are, what you have to think about, you might think about a clinical trial or some sort of project, and you have to sit down and think about all the risks and things that might happen during the trial, and everything you can think of. And then what you do is you allocate to each of those risks, you allocate an impact and a probability. So you could say divide the impact into low, medium and high risk, and likewise the probability in low, medium and high. But then you would plot your risks on a chart. So we've got about 6 risks here, 5 or 6 risks here, and we've just plotted those, and we've got one over here that has a very low probability but a potentially a high impact. Then you've got quite a few that the impact isn't huge, but they're of increasing probability, and there's one right at the top which has huge impact and could happen. And actually, obviously, that's not what you want. So you've done your mapping, you've popped it on your chart, and you now need to sort of step back and decide where these sit and what to do about these different risks. What do you need to do? Now, this is where we come into what's called the 4 T's of risk management. Now, we've divided up those the chart into these 4 areas. Those crosses are in the same places as they were before, and we have the 4 boxes. We've got transfer, terminate, tolerate, and treat. So I was just trying to think of examples for each. So I'll just start with transfer, and obviously one of the things that could happen in a clinical trial is that there could be a serious adverse event that's SUSAR, so serious unexpected adverse reaction that's related to the drug, and therefore the person's been injured and they're entitled to claim compensation for their injuries. And I'm happy to say this happens very rarely, but if and when it does, then obviously the insurance, the compensation payout can be huge. Now, with all clinical trials, companies are required to take out insurance to protect the company from these types of claims, so that if a patient does place a compensation claim, it's actually covered by the insurance company. Now, that is actually transferring out the risk, so you're transferring the risk of that to the insurance company. You're paying your premiums, and obviously in the hope that it never happens, but if it does happen, it's the insurance company who would pick up and manage that risk, so the risk doesn't sit with the company. The other risk is actually, this has slid around a bit. The next risk is in terminate. Now this box here, this is these are risks that are likely to happen and would have a huge impact on the study. Now, these are the risks you basically must make sure have been stopped before they even start. Now, in clinical trials, these are the risks we think about when we're designing a protocol. So we would do anything we could to make sure something doesn't happen, that there is a risk of happening. So for instance, if you're developing a new drug, then often what we do is we will exclude patients who are particularly vulnerable. So we can get to the point where we've excluded so many patients that are particularly vulnerable, we've got none left. But often what we're trying to do is, say for instance, when we put in, and it's very standard in lots of protocols, that we wouldn't include patients with significant or clinically significant liver failure or clinically significant renal failure, because perhaps the drug is metabolized through the liver and excreted through the kidneys, and therefore any damage in that area would increase the blood levels of the drug, and that could precipitate an adverse event. So you don't want to have patients who aren't going to be able to metabolize and excrete the drug, so you make sure that they're not in the study, so you prevent them from being in the study, so you terminate that risk at that stage. The other risks we've got here are have less impact, but they're of increasing probability. So we've got down on the bottom, we've got across there in tolerate. Now these are, as I said, these are low-level risks. You might decide, well, at this stage you're deciding that you're going to tolerate them. You'll live with them. You know they're going to happen, but you're tolerating them. But I would say with that type of risk, you've identified it. You've said, okay, this is a risk. You've identified it. You might say, well, we're just going to have to live with that, but manage it. For instance, an example would be, say you've got a clinical trial where the site is generating a lot of data queries because of inaccuracies and mistakes in the data. and you're often having to go back to, as a monitor, having to go back to get this corrected. Now, this is all part and parcel of the job, so you sort of live with it and tolerate it and manage it. But actually, up to a point, because you're keeping an eye on it, but up to a point, it might become more of a problem. In which case, it could, it's becoming more frequent, so it's moving up the graph, and equally, it could go up to have more impact on the study. So you need to keep an eye on those ones that you tolerate. On a sort of patient safety perspective, you could have you could have a new drug where the early trials have shown that the patients experience dizziness, and that in itself is one of those symptoms that people often can occur, and generally you tolerate it, the patients tolerate it, the company don't regard it as anything other than something that pops up sometimes. But again, you are keeping an eye on it. Now obviously, if it turns out that 80% of patients are experiencing this dizziness, well, that's actually a problem. One or two, okay, but if more people are tolerating it, that's actually could be a problem. And of course, it could be that the consequences of that could be more severe, and it may lead to a patient falling, breaking their hip, their leg, whatever. So that's an example of one you can tolerate, but you need to keep an eye on it. It's it's no good just saying, well, we'll live with that, that's that, we're not going to look at it again. It's a question of keeping an eye on it. Now, the ones where there's a high probability but relatively low impact, compared to the most extreme, are in the treat box, and these are the ones we need to be working with. We need to do something about. So we would say treat. What we often call this is either risk manage it or mitigate the risk. So that's where we might want to think about putting in processes and procedure training, or whatever you need, just to sort of minimize the risk. So for example, again, thinking of patient safety type risks, if we have a drug where it's very important that patients take their drug twice a day, but they don't take more, and that's often the case, you'd want to make sure patients do take their treatment, but they're not taking too much. Then blister packing the drug supplies is a good way of making sure that patients, they can see at a glance whether they've taken their medication or when they should take their medication. So they can't accidentally take 2 tablets in the same morning thinking they haven't taken it previously, because they can see at a glance if they've taken that morning's medication. So that's a way of sort of helping manage the risks of inappropriate dosing in a safety situation. Thinking about more of the, as I said, the uncertainty risks, and we talked earlier about recruitment. This is certainly, it happens a lot, doesn't it? You certainly don't want it to get so extreme that your trial is unable to complete. So you would want to be tracking recruitment and actually have a plan as to what you're going to do if recruitment doesn't achieve the particular targets you've set. So you would want to have a contingency plan, maybe negotiate some funding. So given the right type of study, it may be that you allow recruitment to start, but after 6 months, if recruitment hasn't achieved particular targets, you implement a large recruitment drive, perhaps using radio advertising or something, in order to sort of achieve the targets you're setting. So that's again about tracking it and then having a plan to manage it. In another respect, there's the risks that are associated with bringing in a new member of staff into the team. Obviously, that presents a risk. They're an unknown quantity. They may have the experience and apparently the training and qualifications, but you might you know they're a bit of an unknown quantity. So you might, as a sort of routine, particularly somebody in a very important role in the trial, actually implement a sort of a mentoring arrangement for a number of weeks so they work with a more experienced member of staff, somebody who's familiar with the study, so that they're not just launched into it on their own without any support. So that would obviously be a way of managing the risks associated with someone inexperienced working on the trial. So those are some sort of ideas for what the risks are: transfer, termination, tolerate or treat. So quite nice, and quite simple, but quite a nice way of looking at risks and putting them in the right box. So the next bit we're going to talk about is looking a bit more at the process. Now this is a process that comes from the ISO that I mentioned earlier, but it's been mapped over into clinical research as well. But this is the standard process for risk management, and it's a little bit hard to see in one go. So I have actually just broken up bit by bit in the following slides, but I will just at this stage point out. So we've got the main elements are: you start with a risk assessment, you then go on to risk control, and then risk review. But there's always using risk management tools need to be factored in, but also risk communication, and that's a really important aspect of risk. It's all very well if you sort out the risk to your own satisfaction and you manage it, but obviously everyone involved in the project needs to know how these risks are being managed, so that they do the appropriate thing if it comes up, and they know how people are managing it. So it's very important that there's good communication. Okay, so that's the overview. We'll just look at risk management. The first section is risk assessment, and this is the first few steps are: gather the information to identify the risks, and then establish what really matters, identify the risks, and it says set tolerance limits. So this is so for instance, what it's very important to do is actually be very clear of what the risk is, so what you call the risk. So risk identification, it's an important step in the whole process of risk management. So you need to be very clear what it is. What is the risk? Let's give it a name. So you've identified it. What they mean by tolerance limits is really how often are you going to allow this risk to occur in order to tolerate it. So we talked earlier about those data queries or those episodes of dizziness. You might say, right, we'll allow, we'll give a percentage and allow that, but once it goes beyond that, then we need to do something about it. So setting those sort of tolerance limits is a good thing to do up front, so that as soon as it comes close to that, you realise, okay, this is becoming more frequent problem than we can tolerate. We're going to have to look at this. So the next step is called the risk control step. So you're looking at you've identified the risks, and you are, as I said, you've decided whether or not they're acceptable. If they're acceptable, you obviously will report them, but you record them as being something you're going to accept and what the tolerance limits are, and that's lovely. That puts it out of the way. But if they're not acceptable, then you have to do something about reducing the risk or mitigating the risk. Okay, this is what we talked about just now. So you would think about how you would manage it, how you would mitigate it, so and work out what you have to do, and each risk is therefore has an implementation plan and quality limits, tolerance limits. So for each risk you would map out exactly how you're going to manage it. So you start by listing all the risks, and then you would start to write basically it's a strategy for managing each of the risks that you can't accept. Okay, so this is how your risk management plan develops. So you've identified the risks, you've identified whether they're acceptable or not, and then you have a plan for those that aren't acceptable. So the next part is, if the trial's ongoing, then obviously if the trial is not ongoing, then obviously what you do is you would capture the key points in your report. But if the trial is ongoing, and let's imagine you're doing your risk review, you've done your risk management at the beginning, and then you've got your plan, but you keep reviewing it. So the idea isn't that you just do this at the beginning, that's lovely, work them all out and put it away. The risk management plan is never looked at again once the trial's up and running. It's very important that it's reviewed, and obviously many trials these days actually have a risk manager, so their whole job is keeping an eye on risk. But if you don't have a risk manager, then it's something that you can actually say, well, we will have a quarterly meeting or a monthly meeting just to look at what the risks are and have a think about where we are. So you need actively reviewing the risk each time. So I'm just going to flick back quickly to that chart, the big picture. So just coming from the top, so you go down through identification of the risk, determining whether it's acceptable or not. If it's not acceptable, you write out a strategy for it, and then you continue to manage the risk and keep an eye on the risk all the time, and you keep going round that cycle with using whatever tools you have, but also making sure everybody's communicated, all the information is communicated. Okay, so that underpins the basic process. We will look a little bit later at how that features in ICH GCP, but just now I'm going to work through an example using what's called a bow tie diagram, and I think it's just quite a neat way of again mapping things out a bit. So this is called a bow tie diagram. It's not obvious at the moment why it's called a bow tie diagram, but we'll see a bit later. But if you have a hazard, there are always there's an impact, as we talked about earlier, and there are potential consequences. So I'm just going to work through an example. So, and I wasn't directly working on this. This happened in a trial that I was aware of, but I wasn't working on it. But it was big asthma program, and the inspectors had come in, and they were not happy that there was adequate endpoint verification. So this meant that they'd come in and looked at the data, and the endpoint of the study was serious asthma attacks. And serious asthma attacks were defined as a patient requiring hospitalisation for an asthma attack, or consulting a healthcare professional, their GP, or maybe a nurse. But also the patients were able to self-classify their own symptoms and mark themselves up as having had a serious asthma attack if they felt themselves it was a serious asthma attack. So now the inspectors were looking therefore in the data for verification of these serious asthma attacks, and they didn't feel that there was enough in the data set, so they couldn't verify the data to their own satisfaction. So the company were faced with this major problem, because basically it compromised the integrity of the data, because certain parts of the data, very critical parts of the data, couldn't be validated or verified, which was a problem. The marketing authorization, if it hadn't been resolved, this issue would have been declined. I mean, obviously they were not at all happy with this situation, so they weren't going to give approval. And there's also the possibility that the company could be compromised for having not properly managed patient safety, which was not a good position to be in. So having found themselves in this situation, you then have their first job was obviously to recover it. So this is what's called, they're in this situation, the first thing they have to do is recover the situation. So now there obviously were more consequences than the 3 I've popped down there. You could go on, but I've just given you 3 as a sort of top line example. So what we're encouraged to do is look at the root cause. And why did this happen in the first place? So we looked at the root cause because there were other trials going on, but we had to recover the situation for this one. Now, this one, it was actually already done. So the study was had finished. So it'd been run by a CRO. So the sponsor company was slightly remote from it, but they basically had to go out, make a protocol amendment, and actually set about doing 100% source data verification on the endpoint data. So they, having this study having finished some time ago, everybody that was working on it had been moved on to other studies, but they basically had to set up a whole new team whose job it was to go out and source this new information. We had to go amend the protocol. They had to go back to ethics committee. They had to get approval to go to not just look at the data in the research sites, but also go back to the patients' GPs, also contact other hospitals with emergency admissions for patients who are admitted to other hospitals, and they had to find verification data for all of the endpoints. And it was a real challenge. It was a lot of work. Then obviously this data had to come in. The whole study had to be reanalyzed. Every single endpoint had to be reassessed as to whether there was enough source data or not. If it was very subjective, then they had to decide robustly what to do with the data in a very transparent and careful way, and they had to then go obviously and review other trials which were affected in the same way. So it was a massive piece of work. So that was the recovery bit. It's not all of the recovery, as I say, but recovery, what they had to set about doing. Ooh, looks like my diagram's gone a bit wobbly. Okay, now the other part, and this is where the bow tie comes in. So you've got one half of the bow tie there, but we also have to look at now. Imagine this. That was one trial program with the drug, but that particular company had other drugs that they were developing in asthma. They didn't want to find themselves back in the same place again, so they needed to look at the threats, the things that contributed to this happening. So they had to look back, and they had, again, I've just picked out 3, but and there were many more, but they needed to look at these particular 3. So it basically worked out that they weren't really tracking these serious adverse events, the asthma events. So the data was coming in, but they weren't really tracking how reliable the SDV was, that sort of thing. So that was a problem. The other problem that was recognised was, in fact, because it was a CRO that was monitoring the study and not a sponsor themselves, there was a problem of the flow of information from the CRO, from the research site to the CRO to the sponsor. Information that was made available to the CRO didn't necessarily filter up to the sponsor. So issues were dealt with at the CRO level, but some of those issues should have been escalated up to the sponsor. And then actually, in fact, the other thing was that the protocol wasn't clear about what to do. I mean, it was all very well if the patient came back to see the department that were managing their asthma for the trial, and of course all the data was there and fine and dandy, but it wasn't clear in the protocol what to do should the event happen elsewhere. So that wasn't clear. So other protocols needed to be made clear on that point. So that's how we get to the idea of a bow tie. So on the right hand side you have the consequences, and you have to think about how to prevent them, and on the left hand side you have the threats, and you have to think about how to on the right you have the consequences, and you have to think about how to recover them, and on the left you have the threats, and you have to think about how to prevent them. So I mean, that's quite a nice way of sort of mapping, again, sort of pulling out the differences between a consequence and a threat, and just putting it down on paper. So they've got the preventative controls. So what they decided to, they identified the threats, but they decided, again, there was a problem of lack of clarity in the protocol, so they reviewed the protocol and the monitoring plan of all the other trials that were going on in other programs to make sure they're very clear, monitoring that the monitors should be actively making sure that there's full source data for these endpoints. They reviewed the issue management process that they're working with the CRO, looked at the CRO agreement to make sure it was very clear that issues should be escalated, and they updated the risk management plan on the other trials. So that's how they did it. Okay, so that just works through an example, and as I say, the final bit, I'm just going to look through now what came in with the recent GCP guideline integrated addendum that was implemented back in November last year. So these aspects of risk management have come in section 5, so quality management. And the idea is risk management for continuous improvement. So the idea being that you keep going around this cycle and managing your risk and improving your processes and basically improving the quality. So as we see here, we can see that at the top you've got identification of the risk, evaluation of the risk, control. So those are the steps we've already seen. Communication comes in there, so that's a very important step. And review, risk review. So this virtuous cycle is presented in the guideline. So just breaking it down a little bit, they recommend the first part, which is looking at the critical processes and data. So when you're working on a protocol, the sponsor needs to identify those processes and data that are critical to assure human subject protection and reliability of study results. So this is at the stage you're actually developing the protocol. So like I say, you would develop a protocol to minimize risks, so risk to the patient, but you also want to be sure that your data quality is considered as well. So making sure you've written the protocol in such a way as you've optimized your chance of getting reliable data. So risk identification is the next step. So this is you've identified what are critical in terms of the study processes and data, and then you need to consider them whether they're at the system level. So are these these are the facilities, standard operating procedures, systems and personnel, vendors, that sort of thing, or is it at the clinical trial level, which is more at the forefront of working? So investigate how you give the drug, how you design the trial, how you collect the data, that sort of thing, because there are risks risks appear at both levels, and different people will manage the risks at different levels. The next stage is of risk evaluation. So this is a bit like we saw before. So identifying the risks, and you look at them in terms of likelihood of errors occurring. So given the existing risk control, look at the impact of the errors on human subjects and data integrity, and the extent to which such errors would be detectable. So they would want you to consider that. So that's how you look at that. Then risk controls, so identify those risks that should be reduced through mitigating actions or accepted, which is, we've come across that before. So risk control, mitigating activities. They suggest these are some of the mitigating activities. So, as we said, how you design the protocol, how you implement the protocol. That's, for example, protocol implementation. To me, an example of that would be for if I'm placing protocol, looking for sites for a protocol, then obviously I have to think about getting the right sites to run the protocol. I wouldn't take a highly complicated protocol to a centre that hadn't ever done a study so complicated before. So that to me is a sort of a risk consideration. So that's about, I would just make sure the people who are running this particularly complicated protocol have got prior experience and success with other similar studies. Monitoring plans, obviously that's lots of opportunities to manage risk by the way that you write or what you ask monitors to do. So you would need to give them some direction about what they should be looking for, at what stage they might need to alert someone and raise an issue. I mean, that can be useful to sort of plan out. Very difficult sometimes for monitors to necessarily know what the important parts of the protocol are. There's so many that it's good for them to be given a little bit of a steer on this. So that's, monitoring plans are very important. Agreements, these are the sorts of things about managing some of the uncertainty risk. I mean, obviously the better your agreements, the less possibility of people having misunderstandings, particularly financial. So that's important that that's very clear. Mitigating activity, when you're thinking about staffing, definition of roles and responsibilities is very, very good, because if people are clear what their role is and what their responsibilities are, then they know what they're doing. Also, they're clear what they're not doing. So you won't have the situation where several people are responsible for the same thing, because if you have people doing that, then what happens? Nobody's really responsible. It's good for everybody to be clear what they're responsible for, and then obviously they can get on and do it. So being clear about that's very good. Systematic safeguards to ensure adherence to standard operating procedures. Yes, of course. So this would be, for example, the monitors do look at how well standard operating procedures are being followed, but there's always also auditors, or you can have quality assessments, that sort of thing. Training, people should have training in processes and procedures so they know what they're doing. Training is obviously an important way of managing risk, and certainly if your risk assessments show up that things are going wrong, and maybe something that was accepted is happening too often, then one of the things you might do is actually say, okay, I think people aren't clear about what we're supposed to be doing here. What we need to do is get everyone together and just run through this again and have another training episode. So that's the sort of thing that training, how that comes in. So the next thing is, as mentioned before, risk communication. So again, making sure that everybody is kept on board with what's going on. They have access to the risk management plan, and it's constantly under review and update. So that would be that you periodically review the risk and the control measures and have a look at how often things are going wrong, so that you remain on top of everything. And that's certainly encouraged in the risk review. The next bit is risk reporting. So the sponsor now needs to actually discuss risk in their clinical study report, and report deviations from the predefined tolerance limits. So that we have to have a whole section in the final report now about risk. So that is completely new. So that whole bit about risk is new to the GCP arena. Obviously came in with the addendum, but it has also made its way into the European regulation pretty well as it is here. So as and when and if or that comes in and we are part of it, obviously that will apply. And even if we're not a part of the European regulation, then I suspect we'll have something equivalent. So I think risk management in clinical trials is with us to stay, and so I think it's a good thing to sort of start thinking about it. Now that obviously is something we cover in the activities. There's an activity on risk management, and it also comes up in the assignment. So, and it's more about a way of clarity in thinking around what are the risks, and then good strategizing as to how to manage it, and an understanding of how important it is. So that's what we're looking for, and it's a sort of a useful skill to develop if you're working in clinical trials. So, okay, hope that was helpful. Thank you very much.